Welcome back to NBC News Channel. Today, we will learn about the issue that has shaken Salem to its core and captured the hearts of millions worldwide, a breathtaking revelation that connects EJ Demera and Kat Green through an extraordinary bond forged during the darkest moments of their lives. This is not simply another Salem romance. This is a story of two souls who found each other in complete darkness, communicating through barriers of consciousness itself, creating an invisible thread that transcended physical limitations and the boundaries between life and death. The mystery voice in the darkness. During EJ Demera's harrowing recovery period in Italy, when his body lay broken and bandaged beyond recognition following the brutal ordeal orchestrated by Clyde Weston, he existed in a twilight realm between consciousness and oblivion. Medical professionals had done everything possible to stabilize his condition, wrapping his entire body in protective bandages, hooking him to countless machines that beeped rhythmically in the sterile silence of the Italian recovery facility. The doctors offered little hope, explaining to Sammy Brady during her heartbreaking visits that EJ's neural pathways showed minimal activity, that he might never wake up, that the damage to his body and mind could prove irreversible, leaving him trapped forever in the prison of his own unresponsive form. Yet through this impenetrable darkness, through the fog of medication and the weight of unconsciousness, something extraordinary began to happen. He became aware of a presence, a voice that seemed to float through the void like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. This voice was different from the clinical tones of medical staff discussing his prognosis in hushed Italian, different from Sammy's tearful pleas for him to fight and return to her and their children. This voice was gentle yet steady, filled with emotion and understanding, reading passages that spoke of passion, tragedy, and souls destined to find each other across impossible distances. The words came from Emily Bronte's masterpiece, Wuthering Heights, each sentence carefully enunciated, each emotion fully conveyed through the speaker's interpretation. Though EJ could not open his eyes, could not move a single muscle or utter a word in response, some deep part of his consciousness clung to this voice like an anchor, keeping him tethered to the world of the living. He had no idea who was reading to him, whether it was a nurse assigned to provide sensory stimulation, a volunteer from a local charity organization, or simply someone else recovering in the adjacent room of the facility. All he knew was that when this voice spoke, the crushing weight of his isolation lifted ever so slightly, and somewhere in the darkness, hope flickered like a candle refusing to be extinguished. Kat's own battle for survival. In another room of that same Italian medical facility, Kat Green was fighting her own desperate battle for recovery. The circumstances that brought her to Italy remained fragmented in her memory, pieces of a puzzle scattered by trauma and the effects of whatever ordeal had nearly claimed her life. She spent countless hours staring at unfamiliar ceilings, her body weak and unresponsive, her mind struggling to process what had happened and how she had ended up thousands of miles from home in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language. The medical staff treated her with professional kindness, but the language barrier created walls of isolation around her, making her feel more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. Depression settled over her like a thick blanket, threatening to smother whatever fighting spirit remained within her damaged body and psyche. During her own physical therapy sessions, when nurses would wheel her through the hallways to build her strength and prevent muscle atrophy, Kat noticed a room where a heavily bandaged patient lay completely still, surrounded by more medical equipment than she had ever seen concentrated around a single person. Occasionally she glimpsed a blonde woman sitting beside the patient, head bowed in prayer or grief, hands clutching his motionless ones with desperate intensity. Something about this scene pierced through Kat's own suffering and made her realize that whatever pain she endured, others were fighting even harder battles in the rooms around her. When her therapist explained in broken English that the patient had been the victim of a terrible crime and had been comatose for weeks with little sign of improvement, Kat felt an overwhelming compulsion to do something, anything, to help. The facility's social coordinator, understanding Kat's need to feel useful and connected during her own recovery, suggested that she might visit other patients when she felt strong enough. Reading to comatose patients was considered beneficial therapy, the coordinator explained, as studies showed that familiar voices and engaging stories could sometimes stimulate brain activity and provide comfort even when consciousness seemed completely absent. Kat embraced this opportunity with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. grateful to have purpose beyond her own rehabilitation and a way to combat the crushing loneliness that threatened to consume her during the endless Italian afternoons. The beginning of an invisible bond. When Kat first entered the room of the bandaged patient, she had no idea she was looking at E.J. DeMera, the powerful district attorney from Salem whose name and face she would later come to know so well. All she saw was a human being wrapped in layers of medical dressings, his features completely hidden, his identity reduced to the steady beep of heart monitors and the gentle rise and fall of his chest. She pulled a chair close to his bedside, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the book she had chosen for this first reading session, her personal copy of Wuthering Heights, worn and beloved, its pages marked with notes and observations from multiple readings over the years. Kat began to read, her voice uncertain at first, wondering if this was foolish, if her words were simply disappearing into the void with no impact whatsoever. But as she continued, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, a subtle change she could not quite define but definitely felt. She found herself reading with more passion, investing emotion into Catherine Earnsha's declarations and Heathcliff's fierce devotion, letting the tragic beauty of Bronte's prose flow through her own interpretation. She spoke of moors and storms, of love that transcended death itself, of souls so intertwined that separation became physical agony. When she finished the first chapter and prepared to leave, she noticed that she felt lighter, less burdened, as if sharing these words with the silent patient had somehow eased her own pain. Kat returned the next day, and the day after that, establishing a ritual that became the cornerstone of both their recoveries. She would arrive each afternoon, settle into the chair that began to feel like her own special place, and continue reading from where she had left off. Sometimes she would add her own commentary, sharing her thoughts about the character's motivations or the symbolism in particular passages. She began talking to him between chapters, telling him about her own day, her struggles with physical therapy, her homesickness for a place she could not quite remember clearly, her fears about what would happen when she was finally discharged from the facility. The nurses noticed that Kat's mood improved dramatically on days when she visited the mysterious bandaged patient, and they encouraged her to continue these sessions as part of her own therapeutic process. Connection beyond consciousness. What Kat did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that E.J. was aware of her presence in ways that defied medical explanation. In his comatose state, where time moved differently and consciousness floated like mist, her voice became his reality. The single constant in an otherwise chaotic mental landscape filled with fragmented memories and pain. He found himself anticipating the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, the rustle of pages being turned, the slight catch in her breath when she reached particularly emotional passages in the novel. When she spoke about Catherine and Heathcliff's impossible love, E.J. felt every word resonating in the deepest parts of his being, as if the story was somehow about them, about two souls finding each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. On some level that E.J. could not articulate even to himself, he began trying to respond to Kat's visits, concentrating whatever remained of his conscious will on moving a finger, on changing his breathing pattern, on sending some signal that he heard her and that her presence mattered more than she could imagine. The medical equipment would occasionally register small spikes in his brain activity during the afternoon hours when Kat typically visited, but the doctors dismissed these as random fluctuations, meaningless noise in the data rather than evidence of emerging consciousness. Only Sammy, during her increasingly infrequent visits as she was pulled back to Salem by family obligations, noticed that E.J. seemed somehow more present, more alive, though she had no explanation for this subtle change and attributed it to wishful thinking on her part. Kat, meanwhile, developed the strange conviction that the patient could hear her, that somewhere beneath the bandages and the medical-induced unconsciousness, a person was listening and holding onto her words like a drowning person clutching a rope. She began choosing her passages more carefully, selecting sections that spoke of hope rather than despair, of reunion rather than eternal separation. She would lean close and whisper encouragements between chapters, urging him to keep fighting, to not give up, to find his way back to the light and to whatever life awaited him beyond these sterile walls. In the moments of deepest connection, Kat felt as though she could sense his response, as if their minds were somehow touching across the barrier of his comatose state, communicating in a language that needed no words or consciousness. Mutual healing through shared experience. As weeks turned into months, both Kat and EJ made remarkable progress that surprised their respective medical teams. Kat's physical rehabilitation accelerated beyond expectations, her body responding to treatments with unusual vigor, as if she had found a reason to fight that transcended mere survival. She credited much of her improvement to the daily reading sessions, explaining to her doctors that having someone who needed her, even someone who could not acknowledge that need, gave her purpose and motivation when her own recovery felt pointless. The facility's psychologist noted in Kat's records that the patient visits served as highly effective therapy for her depression and isolation, providing structure and meaning during a period that otherwise might have been dominated by despair. EJ's progress, while slower and more subtle, was nonetheless undeniable. His vital signs stabilized and then began to improve. His brain activity patterns showed increasing complexity, and eventually he began demonstrating small physical responses that indicated emerging consciousness. The medical team could not explain why EJ was recovering, and all indicators had suggested he would remain in a vegetative state indefinitely. But they documented his progress with cautious optimism and adjusted their treatment protocols accordingly. What they did not note in their official records was that EJ's most significant improvements consistently occurred in the afternoons, during the hours when a young woman sat at his bedside reading from a battered copy of Wuthering Heights. On some intuitive level, Kat began to understand that she and her patient were healing each other, engaged in a symbiotic relationship where her voice and presence stimulated his recovery while his need for her attention gave her the will to overcome her own trauma. She confided to the nurses that she had come to care deeply about the bandaged patient, that she prayed for his recovery with the same intensity she had once reserved only for her own healing, that the thought of leaving the facility without knowing his fate filled her with inexplicable grief. The head nurse, a kind Italian woman with decades of experience, smiled knowingly and told Kat that such bonds sometimes formed in medical facilities, that shared suffering created connections that transcended normal social boundaries, and that Kat should not feel ashamed of her attachment. The painful separation. The day finally came when Kat's doctors declared her ready for discharge. Her physical recovery was complete, her vital signs stable, and arrangements had been made for her transport and ongoing care back in the United States. Kat received this news with mixed emotions, grateful to be leaving but devastated at the thought of abandoning the patient who had become so central to her own healing journey. She spent her final afternoon at his bedside reading the concluding chapters of Wuthering Heights, her voice breaking with emotion as she described Catherine's death and Heathcliff's anguished response. When she reached the novel's ambiguous ending, where the ghosts of Catherine and Heathcliff supposedly wander the moors together for eternity, Kat allowed herself to cry, tears streaming down her face as she closed the book for the last time. "I don't know who you are," Kat whispered to the motionless figure, her hand resting gently on his bandaged arm, "but you saved me. Giving you these stories, talking to you every day, it gave me a reason to keep going when I had nothing else. I hope you wake up. I hope you recover and go home to people who love you. I hope someday you know that there was someone who cared about you when you couldn't care for yourself, who sat with you in the darkness and refused to let you be alone." She left the book on his bedside table, a gift and a memorial to the connection they had shared, and walked out of the room without looking back, afraid that if she did, she would not have the strength to leave. In his comatose state, EJ experienced Kat's departure as a profound loss, a ripping away of the single anchor that had kept him connected to life and hope. The afternoons became empty again, filled with impersonal voices of medical staff and the oppressive silence of machines. Without Kat's voice to guide him, EJ drifted in darkness, struggling to find the motivation to continue the exhausting work of climbing back toward consciousness. Weeks later, when he finally opened his eyes and began the long process of piecing together what had happened to him, EJ retained only the vaguest memories of his time in the coma, but the sound of a woman's voice reading about doomed love on the English moors remained with him, a ghost of a memory that he could not quite grasp but that haunted his dreams and his waking thoughts. The shocking recognition in Salem. Years passed before Kat and EJ's paths crossed again, this time in Salem under vastly different circumstances. Kat had become EJ's assistant at the hospital, a professional relationship that slowly deepened into genuine friendship and mutual respect. Neither had any idea of their previous connection, any awareness that they had already saved each other's lives in a foreign country during their respective darkest hours. They simply enjoyed each other's company, finding themselves surprisingly compatible despite their different backgrounds and personalities. When they encountered each other at the bookstore one afternoon and discovered they both had a passionate attachment to Wuthering Heights, they laughed about the coincidence, never suspecting the profound truth underlying this shared literary love. The revelation began with fragmented memories surfacing during Kat's conversations with Andrew Donovan about her time in Italy. She remembered the medical facility, the bandaged patient, the afternoon reading sessions that had meant so much to her recovery. When Andrew confirmed that AJ had been receiving treatment at that same facility during that exact time frame, Kat felt the world tilt beneath her feet as impossible connections began forming in her mind. The memory of seeing a blonde woman at the patient's bedside suddenly made perfect sense if it had been Sammy Brady, AJ's wife, visiting during one of the brief periods when Kat had not been in the room. Every detail clicked into place with stunning clarity, the bandages hiding his identity, the timing of their respective treatments, the remarkable recovery that had defied medical expectations. Kat realized with overwhelming certainty that the patient she had read to, the voiceless presence who had given her own life meaning during those dark Italian months, had been EJ. The man she had come to care for as a friend and colleague, the person whose company she increasingly sought and valued, was the same soul she had connected with years ago across the barriers of consciousness and identity. The coincidence seemed too impossible to be mere chance, as if fate itself had orchestrated their reunion and was now revealing the invisible threads that had always bound them together. The emotional confrontation and truth. When Kat finally gathered the courage to tell AJ what she had discovered, she chose a quiet moment when they were alone in his office, away from the chaos of the hospital and the prying eyes of Salem's gossip networks. "I need to tell you something about Italy," she began, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation she was about to deliver. She described the medical facility, the bandaged patient, the daily reading sessions from Wuthering Heights, watching as EJ's expression transformed from polite attention to stunned recognition. "You were the one reading to me," EJ whispered, his voice barely audible as memories he had dismissed as fever dreams suddenly coalesced into concrete reality. "I remember your voice. I remember how you made Catherine and Heathcliff come alive. I remember feeling like I was drowning and your words were the only thing keeping me from slipping away completely." He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly as tears streamed down his face, overcome by the magnitude of what they were both understanding. "I never knew who you were. I spent years wondering if I had imagined you, if you were just a hallucination my damaged brain created to give me something to hold on to. But you were real. You were there. You saved my life, Kat." Kat was crying now too, years of wondering about the bandaged patient's fate finally resolved. The mystery of why she felt so inexplicably drawn to EJ suddenly explained by the invisible bond they had forged in that Italian medical facility. "You saved mine too," she told him, her voice breaking with emotion. "Reading to you, talking to you, having someone who needed my pulled me through my own darkness when I wanted to give up. We saved each other, EJ. Somehow, impossibly, we found each other when we both needed saving the most, and now fate has brought us back together." The moment stretched between them, charged with the weight of their shared history and the stunning realization that they had been connected long before either of them knew the other's name. The professional boundaries that had previously defined their relationship seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of this extraordinary bond that transcended time, consciousness, and the normal rules of human connection. EJ pulled Kat into his arms, holding her tightly as they both wept, mourning the years they had been apart while celebrating the miracle of their reunion and the impossible love story that fate had written for them across two countries and through circumstances that should have destroyed them both but instead had brought them together.